Hello, this is another Doctor Who review. I'm not really sure who I'm doing these for because I don't think much of anybody who follows me, which is about 3 people. Don't think any of them are all that much interested in Doctor Who, but anyway, I enjoy talking about it even if no one is particularly interested in listening to it. Today I want to review this episode. There we go, Pyramids of Mars. Which is another Tom Baker episode. This one from 1975. I'm opting for that. To some extent, I'm doing them slightly at random, but at this one, a few days ago, well, a week ago, I finished writing a manuscript for a book on Egyptian mythology and history, which is just being proofread at the moment and will be winging its way to the publisher shortly. So this is kind of fits in with that. I've been thinking, obviously, and researching around a great deal of Egyptian mythology, and this does draw on that, which is why I've chosen to do this episode rather than some other episode. So, quick plot summary. I'll try to avoid too many spoilers and talk around it. The whole thing is set in 1911. The episode opens, it's a 4-part one, but it opens with a bit of stock footage of Egypt. And there's an excavation taking place, and it's all very kind of Lord Carnarvon-ish, as Professor Scarman is opening up this new tomb, and there's his sort of Egyptian helpers and assistants with him, and they open it up, and there's all these sinister green lights, and we find out later, we don't see what he finds initially. He's just looking at this thing with a green light with a horrified expression on his face. We only find out later what it is that he's looking at. Then the episode shifts through to the TARDIS, and then it shifts through to England in 1911, and Professor Scarman's home, which has been temporarily taken over by this chap called Ibrahim Namin, who is the whole adventure is heavily influenced by those Universal Pictures mummy films, the old black and white ones, and the character of Imhotep and Ahmed Bey and all those sorts of figures. So this Namin is very much within that tradition, even down to wearing the fez, sitting there playing mad organ music in the professor's home. He's a high priest devoted to the worship of the ancient Egyptian god Sutekh. Sutekh is a real Egyptian deity. There are variant spellings of his name, and I've written a fair amount about him in the manuscript I've not long finished. Sutekh, Setek, Seth, Set, the variant spellings thereof. In late Egyptian mythology, well, comparatively late, we are talking many thousands of years ago, but comparatively late Egyptian mythology, there was a period in which Egypt was taken over by a different ethnic group, the Hyksos. And to this day, no one is entirely sure who the Hyksos are. Various different historians and archaeologists and what have you argue it's this group or that group or some other group, but no one is 100% sure who the Hyksos were. But they came into power. They ruled Egypt for a few centuries and dominated the area. The ordinary population of Egypt, the people tilling the fields and fishing the Nile, they were exactly the same people they'd always been. It was the aristocracy that underwent this kind of change in power structure. And they were very much taken with the god Setech, or Sutekh, if we'll stick to Sutekh, the name that's used in the Doctor Who episode. Up until that point in Egyptian history, Sutekh had been the god of the desert, a rather wild, dangerous, somewhat frightening god, but fundamentally a god on the side of Ma'at, of law and order and justice. So he stood at the front of the barge of the sun god as it was descending into the underworld and fought off the various monsters of the underworld, was regarded as having the power to overcome and, well, not outright destroy the great demon Apepi, but temporarily defeat him, because, a bit like the Master in Doctor Who, Apepi is never entirely defeated. Always comes back again and again and again. That's a recurrent motive. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that Sutekh was a a force for goodness, albeit a very scary force for goodness. When the Hyksos were finally booted out of Egypt and the native population had an uprising and drove them out centuries down the line, and that's a weird one, isn't it? Because we're kind of going off at a tangent, but you think a group of people who've been living in a country for several centuries, by the end of the reign, they're born and bred in Egypt. Are they still foreign? Are they still a scary occupying foreign force? Or have, over the course of generation after generation after generation, they have become as naturalized an Egyptian as anyone else, but they were perceived by the long-term native Egyptians as still being a foreign force, foreign invaders, even after all of those generations had passed of occupation. But they drove them out. And because Sutekh had been their favourite god, once the Hyksos were booted out of Egypt, he kind of fell from favour, and the cult of Azza, the god that is referred to by the Greeks as Osiris, who is also mentioned in the Doctor Who episode. They came to greater prominence, and so Sutekh becomes seen as this rather malign, dangerous force, the enemy of his brother Osiris, and the murderer of the brother Osiris. And he becomes seen as this almost demonic character, which is how he's portrayed in the Doctor Who episode. So back to the plot. Bit of history, back to the plot. The TARDIS materialises. I should have said the Sutekh makes his presence known in the TARDIS itself. Sarah Jane sees this kind of visionary manifestation, and the TARDIS lands in England in 1911, and they land inside this old priory house, which is the site. They were aiming to land in Unit, but they've landed in the building, the priory, that was on the same site as the Unit building, but at a much earlier period of history, before the Unit building is constructed. And they very rapidly get involved in all the mysteries going on in the house. There's the doddery old butler, who was played by an actor who also appeared in To the Manor Born, which was a very entertaining, for a kind of upper class comedy, if you like, about the lady of the manor. All terribly English and terribly posh, but very, very good and well done. Going back, that was the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, To the Manor Born. I like that show. Anyway, the butler gets bumped off fairly quickly, so there's very much of a bit part for him, unfortunately. But it becomes clear that there's all sorts of sinister forces at play, and it's not just this mad fanatic high priest, but that there are alien presences at play in the old priory. All sorts of shifty things are going on. A friend, Dr. Warlock, comes along, who's a friend of Professor Scarman, and he wants to know what's going on and why isn't he allowed in the house, and why hasn't he heard anything from his friend, and it all spirals out of control. The actor who plays Dr. Warlock, Peter Copley, also appeared in 101 shows, but he appeared particularly in the Cadfael, the early Cadfael series about Brother Cadfael investigating crimes and murders and what have you in medieval times. He appeared as the elderly abbot, the very first abbot. They change abbots halfway through the season, and he is this sweet little old abbot who's very nice and very unworldly. Nice actor, very, very good character actor. I'll come back to him momentarily. But then, anyway, it spirals out. So because Dr. Warlock gets injured, the doctor and Sarah Jane have to rush in to find help, and as they're rushing off, the mummies appear. and they freaked the hell out of me as a child, I have to say. These huge, great, cumbersome figures with they're not like the kind of decaying, rotting mummies you get in horror films. They're all heavily bandaged up, so there's no face, there's no eyes, there's no mouth, they don't speak. They're these just kind of lumbering figures covered in bandages with these weird chests that come out at a strange angle. Eventually transpires they're robots, but they go lumbering around the countryside trying to find the injured man who's legged it away from the evil Ibrahim Namin. And they seek shelter in the house of Professor Warlock's brother, who is played by Michael Shard, who I mentioned in a previous review, because it also is one of these actors who appeared in lots of different episodes of Doctor Who as lots of different characters. Often he plays these rather grim, sour, harsh figures, but in this particular appearance, the brother he plays is a very sweet, very gentle man, very boyish, very otherworldly in all sorts of ways. But it's a very fast-moving episode, so they find salvation, temporary salvation, in this man's house. But the forces of evil are already gathering outside, even as we speak, and there's death and carnage and destruction, and barely a pause to draw breath as they're rushing from one event to the next, which keeps up a cracking pace. The brother has invented this device that receives radio waves from other planets, from the stars, and is way ahead of its time. So obviously a very, very clever man. And it's picked up messages coming from Mars. And it transpires, long story short, that there is an ancient race, the Azarians, who had this huge war hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, in their own solar system, and it kind of spread out across the galaxy. A war between one particular rebel Azerian, Setech, and the rest of the Azerians. I'm sure there must have been other followers to Setech as well. So yeah, this kind of the forces of evil and the forces of good, and eventually they chased him across the galaxies, and they tracked him down. And on Earth, they capture him and they paralyze him, and they put him underneath a pyramid in Egypt. And the device that is paralyzing him is controlled from a structure on the planet Mars, kind of beaming, paralyzing forces through space to keep him trapped. Presumably the idea being that it will be all that much harder for him to get free if the device that's trapping him is on an entirely different planet. It seems, the Doctor says they did this because they couldn't bring themselves to kill him, because if they'd killed him, they'd executed him, then they would be as bad as he is. But I have to say, given the choice between being paralysed in a room for 7,000 years or being executed, I think I'd go for the execution. To me, that seems an awful lot more compassionate than an eternity of imprisonment and paralysis. But different people have different ideas of compassion. And obviously, Sutekh is scheming to get free. Poor old Professor Scarman, when he opens the tomb and he steps through, expecting to find lots of dusty antiquities, and instead finds this malevolent alien being, has triggered off the installation on Mars, which has been sending out these alarm signals, and he becomes the pawn of Sutekh, who, even though he is paralysed, can take over the minds of other beings when he's in close contact with them. And there's this very effective cliffhanger, bearing in mind the sort of special effects budget they had at the day, which was not fantastic. And some of the effects are a little bit clunky, but there's this very effective one where there's a sarcophagus which acts as a gateway between different locations, like a kind of a teleport device, I suppose we'd say. And Ibrahim Namin is praying in front of it. And this figure swathed in black with a black helmet that's very reminiscent of the head of the robot mummies appears through the sarcophagus teleport gateway and then manifests in the room in England. And as the figure steps down a couple of steps from the dais where the sarcophagus is set up, you see his footprint burning the carpet and the smoke kind of billowing up. And as a child watching that, it was bloody creepy, I can tell you. The whole these days, obviously, me being that much older and having seen that many other things, it no longer has quite the effect it did as a child, but it really was disturbing that he was burning the carpet as he walked down. And he takes hold of Namin, and as he holds him, he burns the man. There's smoke kind of billowing up from the black gloved hands, and it is really quite effective for the day in terms of the special effects of the day. This embodiment of malice and evil. It turns out that this is actually, once he takes the garb off, this is actually Professor Scarman, but he is now possessed by the spirit of Sutekh, so it's no longer really him entirely. And there's lots of chasing around and all sorts of palaver. There is another very effective scene, well, I found it very effective, when there's an old poacher going around the estate outside the old priory, taking pot shots at rabbits and what have you. And he gets embroiled in this, and two mummies are sent to trap him down. And eventually they catch him. Bear in mind they have these weird shaped chests. They kind of sandwich him between them, and they crush him to death. And again, it's the sort of thing probably Mary Whitehouse had a bitch fit about back in the day when she was complaining about violence on TV and everything else. It was really disturbing and creepy to see that as a child. These two huge, great, lumbering, looming figures crushing this small old man to death between them. And you don't see gouts of blood and guts and gore like you would these days. It's just kind of again and falls over. But the idea of it, and as a child you have a very vivid imagination. Well, some of us do as adults as well. But you kind of see more into what's going on than you actually see on the screen. So in your mind there's blood and guts and gore, even though there is no blood and guts and gore on the screen. But that was quite an effective thing. They killed just about everybody in the show. It's a bit like one of those Shakespearean tragedies where there's scarcely anyone left alive by the end of it. And that is particularly effective. And this is something that comes up in a number of different Doctor Who episodes. I'm not sure they really do it so much anymore in the new series. I'm struggling to think of examples in the revived series, but certainly in the classic series, that they would create these characters, small parts often, but sympathetic. So like Dr. Warlock, who's this just nice, gentle, decent, caring old man. And they've got had a very good actor who captured that quite readily. And so when he dies, it's the more shocking. He's not just a face in the crowd being zapped. I think there was for example, with Missy, the character of Missy, when she was in the new season, was zapping various different people who were on screen for about 5 seconds until she incinerated them. And there was no real shock value to that because you had no empathy for the people she was killing. They hadn't been around long enough to gain any sense of empathy for them. And I think that's a loss because back when Missy was the Master, was a male character in the classic series, I'm talking about not John Sims, but the classic series, he was quite malevolent, quite malicious. And when he went around murdering people, it was often murdering people you'd got to like as characters. And it was the more shocking for it. So it wasn't just zap, you're dead, and somebody falls in a pile of dust and it's vaguely comedic. And there's something a bit off in a children's show about making murder comedic. It's giving a very odd message out there. It should be shocking. And a villain should be villainous, not comical. Doesn't mean they can't have the odd laugh here and there. But I think the old Master, the Roger Delgado and Anthony Ainley and so, they did malice. And there was a real sense that these people were wrong-uns. There was something deeply evil and unpleasant about the Master when he was going. He wasn't just coming up with mad schemes; he was actually killing nice people, just as the mummies go around killing nice people, and Sutekh goes around killing nice people. And there's a real sense of shock value to that, and there should be. So something to perhaps reflect on. Again, there probably are examples in the new series, where that has happened, and some baddie has killed nice, likable characters. But I'm struggling to think of many examples of that. What else did I want to say? Eventually, they beam up to Mars, and there's some sort of interesting bits where Sutekh exerts his power over the Doctor, directly over the Doctor himself, and the Doctor falls prey to it. He's not able to fight everything off, and there's a real sense of Sutekh is not just one of those cardboard cutout baddies that will be dismissed in 5 minutes. He's dangerous enough to be able to mind control the Doctor. And that's saying something, given that the Doctor is the super genius of the show. It makes the Doctor go to Mars in the TARDIS, because the original plan was to launch a bomb that would blow up the control station on Mars and then liberate Sutekh. Doctor follows that. So now he makes the Doctor, with threats to Sarah Jane and one thing and another, makes the Doctor go to Mars in order to directly disable the device on Mars, the Eye of Horus, and free himself. And they go through the installation of Mars, which is not as effective, I have to say, in terms of sets and props and things like that, as the old Priory, which was very gothic, very in keeping with the whole kind of theme of the thing. The Martian set is a bit cheesy, but never mind. They go through various kind of weird puzzle things that they've got to go through all these different doorways to get to the next chamber and the next chamber and the next chamber before they can make it through to where the Eye of Horus is kept. It does get destroyed, there's a spoiler there, but the Doctor manages to nonetheless defeat Sutekh anyway and plunge him off into oblivion in the void. So he's not dead, he's just floating in the great void for theoretically forevermore. The costume for Sutekh, when he's sitting down, he's got this very Egyptian-style sort of helmet thing on that looks very effective. At one point, he takes the helmet off, and he's got, in Egyptian mythology, Sutekh is represented by the Nehez creature. Nobody quite knows what the Nehez creature is. It looks vaguely dog-like, but it also has unusual features about it that are not dog-like, like a full tail. And so, whereas with the majority of the Egyptian deities, you can tell that Bast has a cat head, that Sebek has a crocodile head. You can sort of look at them and the animals are very readily identifiable. With Sutekh, no one is entirely sure what the animal is meant to be. Is it an aardvark? Is it a greyhound? Is it this? Is it that? Is it the other? Is it some sort of mythical, magical beast rather than an earthly beast? Nobody quite knows. So the costume designers on Doctor Who created this dog-like, kind of vaguely jackal-like mask out of what looks, to be honest, like paper mache. It's not very effective, that bit. He's more sinister when he's got the helmet on than when he's got this kind of dog head thing going on. But I would like to see Sutekh come back. I know he's been in some of the audio stories, but on the TV series, I'd like to see Sutekh come back in a few years' time. And I'm sure they could come up with a more effective, with modern day latex techniques and the rest of it, to make the head of Sutekh much more effective than it was. But as a villain who would be a real sense of menace, a real danger, someone who is in love with destruction for the sake of destruction, who is in love with chaos and hates all living things, wants to kill and slaughter and destroy left, right, and centre. I think that would be a genuine sense of menace, and particularly this idea that he had cult following. And so you could have not just him as a villain, but all of his kind of worshippers like Ibrahim. I mean, all these people devoted to him who think they will get some kind of reward from him, and obviously they never do, but that could be sort of fleshed out as this sinister, malign, Egyptian-style cult at play in the universe, not just on Earth, but in the universe. The actor who did the voice of Sutekh also did the voice of the great beast in the Satan pit. That big horned demon who also possessed Toby Zed and characters like that, and sort of took them over and spoke through them occasionally when they had the red glowing eyes, and Toby Z had sort of runic things painted all over his face. So the same actor, same voice. Again, you never actually see his face either in the Pyramids of Mars or in the Satan Pit. You just hear his voice, Gabriel Wolf. He has one of those voices which is very suited to malevolence and not just malevolence, but slightly posh malevolence, which is somewhat reminiscent of all those Hollywood blockbusters that like to employ English theatrical legends to play the villains, because they see, perhaps because going back to the days of the Civil War and all the rest of it, sorry, not the Civil War, the War for Independence, they see the upper crust English types as villainous. Can't think why. But Gabriel Wolf fits into that pattern. Great actor, and potentially there. I'm not actually sure if Gabriel Wolf is still alive or not. I will have to check on that one. But if he is, he could voice the return of Sutekh at some point in the future. Back in the day, last point to mention, the series was averaging around 10 million viewers per episode, which is a hell of a high number, especially when you consider back in 1975, the size of the population of Britain was a lot lower than it is today. So as a fraction, as a percentage of the overall population, that was a damn sight higher then than the current series gets viewing in terms of the current series as a kind of percentage of the overall population. I think the last New Year's Day episode of Doctor Who went out was around about 5 million viewers, something like that. So that's a hell of a big difference, and it would be lovely to see things go back to the day when a really big chunk of the British population watched and thoroughly enjoyed Doctor Who and look forward to the next cliffhanger and the next and the next. But anyway, that's something to think out. Oh, I should have shown you this. There we go. I've had the novelisation of this. I think I got this one, somewhere around 79, 80, something like that. As a child, I absolutely devoured these Target Doctors. I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of them upstairs gathering dust. These used to be my big holiday treats that I would buy tons of them over the school holidays. My parents would buy tons of them for me over the school holidays, and I would just plough through them. Absolutely love them. At some point, they'll probably be collector's pieces. Anyway, hopefully at least one of my viewers has enjoyed hearing about my thoughts on Doctor Who. And maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. It'd be nice to get some feedback from it. But anyway, take care. Bye-bye.